London, 1805. The magnificent ballroom of Rosemont House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames dancing in gilded mirrors that lined walls draped in crimson silk. Couples swept across the polished marble floor in elegant waltzes, a dazzling display of ivory gowns and midnight evening coats. Yet near the towering marble columns at the room's edge, Celeste Harrington stood perfectly still, a solitary figure in her modest gown of dove grey. At age 29, Celeste had long since accepted her position as the family's quiet sacrifice. Not that anyone would connect her to the two radiant young women currently commanding the ballroom's center stage. The Harrington sisters, Clara and Lillian, were the jewels of the season, each more enchanting than the last, their laughter like crystalline music as gentlemen competed for their attention. "Your sisters have quite captured the room tonight," came a familiar voice edged with concern. Celeste turned to find Lady Evelyn Montclair, her mother's dearest friend, standing beside her with a glass of champagne untouched in her gloved hand. "Indeed, Clara seems to have Lord Ashworth utterly entranced," Celeste replied, managing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And Lillian has no fewer than 4 names on her dance card for the supper waltz." Lady Evelyn's expression grew grave, the lines around her mouth deepening. "And to think your father was on the brink of destitution just last season. One might wonder how he managed such a remarkable transformation in fortune." Celeste's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her fan, the ivory sticks pressing into her palm through her gloves. Few in society knew the truth, that it was her inheritance, the substantial sum left by her maternal grandmother, that had funded her sisters' glittering debuts and secured their positions in society. Her own future had been the price willingly paid. "Providence has smiled upon our family," Celeste said carefully, employing the diplomatic evasion she had perfected over years of deflecting such inquiries. "Providence indeed," Lady Evelyn replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Though I fear Providence may have exhausted its generosity where your father is concerned. My dear Celeste, I tell you this as someone who loved your mother dearly and who holds genuine affection for you. Your father's investments in the textile mills have failed catastrophically. The whispers have already begun circulating through the clubs on St. James Street." A cold dread settled in Celeste's chest, spreading through her limbs like winter frost. "The money is gone, then. All of it." "Every penny and more besides," Lady Evelyn confirmed, her hand briefly touching Celeste's arm in sympathy. "The Harrington name hangs by the most delicate of threads. One scandal, one confirmed whisper of insolvency, and everything you've sacrificed for your sisters will have been for naught. Their engagements would be broken before the banns could be read." Across the vast expanse of the ballroom, Celeste caught sight of her father, Lord Edmund Harrington. His face was flushed with wine, his gestures animated as he held court among a circle of gentlemen near the card-room entrance. At 53, he retained the handsome features and commanding presence that had once made him the most eligible bachelor of his generation, though years of excess and poor judgment had begun to exact their visible toll. Since her mother's death 7 years prior, he had sought solace in increasingly reckless ventures, each more disastrous than the one before. "I shall speak with father in the morning," Celeste said finally, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Perhaps there is something yet to be salvaged." Lady Evelyn's laugh held no trace of humor, only a weary resignation born of watching too many families crumble under the weight of their debts. "My dear girl, what can you possibly do that you haven't already done? You've given everything you had to give." The orchestra struck up a new melody, and the crowd seemed to part as though guided by an invisible hand. A hush fell over the assembly, conversations dying mid-sentence as every head turned toward the ballroom's grand entrance. Even the musicians faltered momentarily before recovering their rhythm. "The Duke of Ravensshire," announced the footman, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room with the weight of ceremony. Benedict Crane, 6th Duke of Ravensshire, stood framed in the arched doorway, his tall figure commanding immediate attention. At 32, he was regarded as England's most eligible and most exacting nobleman, a man whose standards were legendary throughout the ton. His perfectly tailored black evening coat, adorned with intricate silver embroidery at the collar and cuffs, emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the aristocratic bearing that had been bred into the Ravensshire line for generations. His dark hair was styled in the latest fashion, revealing a face of striking handsomeness, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes of the most penetrating blue-grey that seemed to assess and evaluate everything they encountered. "Well," murmured Lady Evelyn, her tone shifting to one of keen interest, "this is most unexpected. His Grace rarely honors gatherings such as these with his presence. I cannot recall the last time he attended a debutante ball." Celeste observed the transformation that swept through the room like wildfire through dry grass. Ambitious mothers straightened imperceptibly, their fans moving with calculated grace as they positioned their daughters to best advantage. Young ladies adjusted their jewels and practiced the demure smiles that had been drilled into them since childhood, each hoping to catch the attention of a duke whose wealth and position were matched only by his notorious selectivity. "I heard he's finally seeking a bride," whispered a young woman nearby, her voice carrying just enough for Celeste to hear. "Lady Dorothea Pemberton is said to be the front-runner. Her dowry is rumoured to be £30,000. "Of course she is," replied her companion with barely concealed envy. "A Duke of Ravenshire's standing doesn't marry just anyone. He requires perfection in breeding, fortune, and beauty." Celeste watched as the Duke moved through the crowd with deliberate purpose, acknowledging the bowing heads and curtsying forms with brief nods but engaging with no one directly. There was something distinctly remote in his manner, as though an invisible barrier separated him from the eager faces surrounding him. His expression remained coolly polite, revealing nothing of his thoughts or intentions as ambitious mothers thrust their daughters forward with transparent desperation. Then, impossibly, his gaze swept across the glittering assembly and settled directly upon her. Celeste's breath caught in her throat as those penetrating eyes locked with hers across the expanse of the ballroom. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she was certain he must be looking at someone behind her, perhaps one of the diamond-draped debutantes clustered near the refreshment table. But no, his attention remained fixed upon her alone, and to her utter astonishment, he began moving in her direction with unmistakable purpose. The crowd seemed to sense the shift in his trajectory, conversations faltering as heads turned to follow his progress. Whispers erupted like a gathering storm as society's most sought-after bachelor walked past the blushing debutantes, past the daughters of earls and viscounts arrayed in their finest silks, past every eligible young woman who had been presented to him with such carefully orchestrated casualness. Lady Evelyn's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Celeste, he's coming directly toward you." Celeste's heart hammered against her ribs as the Duke approached, her mind racing to comprehend what could possibly explain this inexplicable attention. Perhaps he wished to inquire about her father's whereabouts, or needed directions to the card-room. Surely there must be some logical explanation for why England's most discriminating nobleman would seek out the forgotten eldest daughter standing in the shadows. Benedict Ravensshire came to a halt directly before Celeste, close enough that she could see the fine weave of his cravat and smell the subtle scent of sandalwood that clung to him. The ballroom had fallen into an expectant silence so profound that the rustle of silk gowns seemed thunderous. Every eye in the room was fixed upon them, hundreds of spectators waiting to witness whatever would unfold. Then, in a gesture that would be discussed in drawing-rooms across London for years to come, the Duke of Ravensshire knelt before her on the polished marble floor. Gasps erupted throughout the ballroom. Fans fluttered with frantic energy as matrons clutched at their daughters' arms, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Celeste felt the blood drain from her face, her composure threatening to shatter completely as she stared down at the most powerful nobleman in England kneeling at her feet as though she were a queen and he her devoted subject. "Miss Celeste Harrington," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone, rich and cultured with an undercurrent of absolute certainty. "I have observed you these past months at various gatherings, and I find myself compelled to speak plainly. You possess qualities that I value above all others: intelligence demonstrated in your thoughtful engagement with serious discourse, composure maintained even under the most trying circumstances, and a substance of character that transcends the superficial accomplishments so often mistaken for true worth. Celeste's throat had gone completely dry. She was aware of her sisters staring from across the room, their expressions ranging from shock to confusion. Lady Evelyn stood frozen beside her, one hand pressed to her heart as though she might swoon. "I request the honor of courting you," Benedict continued, his blue-grey eyes never leaving her face. "If you would grant me the privilege, I should like to call upon you tomorrow afternoon so that I might speak with your father and formally request permission to pay my addresses to you. I tell you now, before all assembled here, that you are the only lady who has captured my interest and the only one to whom I wish to direct my attentions." The ballroom erupted. Whispers became exclamations, and several young ladies who had harbored hopes of securing the Duke's favor looked as though they might faint from the shock. Celeste could hear fragments of frantic speculation swirling around her. The eldest Harrington girl? But she's practically on the shelf. What could His Grace possibly see in her when Lady Dorothea is right there? Perhaps there's some hidden connection we don't know about. Her gown is last season style, for heaven's sake. Celeste realized that everyone was waiting for her response, that the Duke himself was still kneeling before her with an expression of patient expectation. She forced herself to draw breath, to find her voice despite the unreality of the moment, despite the certain knowledge that this could not possibly be happening to her. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaos in her mind, "you do me extraordinary honor. I confess myself quite overwhelmed by your attention and uncertain what I have done to deserve such distinguished notice." "You have been yourself, Miss Harrington," he replied, rising gracefully to his feet while maintaining eye contact. "That alone sets you apart from the majority of London society. Now, will you grant me the privilege of this dance? I believe a waltz is about to commence, and I should very much like to demonstrate to this assembly that my interest is both genuine and decided." Celeste glanced toward Lady Evelyn, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement, her eyes shining with tears of what appeared to be joy mixed with utter disbelief. Looking back at the Duke, Celeste placed her gloved hand in his extended palm, feeling the firm strength of his grip even through the layers of fabric. "I would be honored, Your Grace." The orchestra, which had been waiting with bated breath along with everyone else, struck up the opening notes of a waltz. Benedict led Celeste onto the dance floor, and the crowd parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses. As he placed his hand at her waist and drew her into the proper position, Celeste was acutely aware of the weight of every gaze upon them, of the furious whispering that had already begun, of the sheer impossibility of what was occurring. "You dance beautifully," Benedict observed as they began to move, his lead confident and assured. "Another accomplishment that has not escaped my notice." "I thank you, Your Grace, though I must confess I rarely have occasion to display such skills. I spend most evenings ensuring my sister's dance cards are properly filled rather than attending to my own." "A sacrifice that speaks to your character," he said, and something in his tone made her look up at him sharply. "You have spent years ensuring your family's success while setting aside your own prospects. That selflessness, combined with your evident capability in managing complex household matters, makes you precisely the sort of woman I have been seeking." There was something in the way he phrased it, seeking rather than longing for, capability rather than beauty, that sent a small chill through Celeste despite the warmth of the crowded ballroom. This felt less like a romantic declaration and more like a business assessment, but she pushed the thought aside. What did it matter whether he loved her, so long as his attention saved her family from ruin? As they swept across the floor in perfect synchronization, Celeste caught glimpses of the reaction surrounding them. Her father stood near the card-room entrance, his face a study in confused delight as he apparently attempted to calculate what advantage might be gained from this unexpected development. Her sisters watched with expressions of genuine happiness mixed with bewilderment. The ambitious mothers and their disappointed daughters wore faces ranging from sour envy to calculated speculation. "I imagine this evening has taken a rather unexpected turn for you," Benedict said, a hint of dry amusement in his voice. "That, Your Grace, might be the greatest understatement uttered in this ballroom tonight," Celeste replied before she could stop herself, then immediately worried she had been too forward. But the Duke's lips curved into what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I appreciate candor, Miss Harrington. It is refreshingly rare in my experience. Tomorrow afternoon, then? Shall we say 3 o'clock? 3 o'clock would be most agreeable, Your Grace." The waltz concluded, and Benedict escorted her back to Lady Evelyn's side with impeccable courtesy. He bowed over her hand with old-fashioned formality, his eyes meeting hers once more with that same penetrating intensity that seemed to see directly into her soul. "Until tomorrow, Miss Harrington. I look forward to our conversation with great anticipation." As the Duke withdrew, moving toward the exit with the same purposeful stride that had brought him to her side, the ballroom exploded into a cacophony of excited speculation. Celeste found herself immediately surrounded by well-wishers and curious interrogators, each desperate to understand how the forgotten spinster had captured the attention of England's most eligible duke. Through it all, Lady Evelyn remained at her side, a steady presence in the chaos. When there was finally a brief moment of relative privacy, she leaned close to Celeste's ear and whispered words that captured the enormity of what had just occurred. "My dear girl, everything has changed. The woman they mocked this morning has become the woman every debutante in London envies tonight." Celeste nodded, still struggling to process the surreal turn her life had taken in the span of a single waltz. She caught sight of her reflection in one of the gilded mirrors. The same modest dove-grey gown, the same understated styling, the same face she had seen that morning when she dressed with no expectation that this day would be anything but ordinary. Yet everything, indeed, had changed. And as she met her own eyes in that mirror, Celeste couldn't shake the feeling that while the Duke's attention had saved her family from ruin, she had somehow stepped onto a path whose destination remained utterly unknown. The following afternoon arrived with unseasonable warmth for early spring, sunlight streaming through the windows of the Harrington townhouse's drawing room as Celeste sat with her hands folded in her lap, waiting. She had dressed with particular care in a gown of soft blue muslin, simple but elegant, and her dark hair was arranged in a style that Lady Evelyn had assured her was both fashionable and flattering. Her sisters had been relegated to the morning room with strict instructions not to interrupt, though she could hear their muffled whispers and occasional bursts of excited laughter filtering through the walls. Her father paced before the fireplace, his movements agitated despite his attempts at composure. Lord Edmund Harrington had spent the morning in a state of barely contained euphoria mixed with anxiety, alternating between congratulating Celeste on her remarkable conquest and frantically calculating how best to leverage this unexpected opportunity. He had already sent his valet 3 times to ensure his cravat was tied to perfection, and his evening coat had been brushed until it gleamed. When the knocker sounded precisely at 3 o'clock, Celeste felt her breath catch in her throat. The previous evening still felt like a dream, something that couldn't possibly have occurred in her ordinary life. Yet here was the proof, the Duke of Ravensshire arriving at her family's modest townhouse to formally request permission to court her. The butler announced the Duke with appropriate ceremony, and Benedict entered the drawing room with the same commanding presence he had displayed at the ball. In the afternoon light, Celeste could see him more clearly, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he was a man who spent considerable time outdoors managing his estates, the firm set of his jaw that spoke of unwavering determination, the cool assessment in his gaze as he surveyed the room's modest furnishings without judgment. The initial pleasantries were brief and formal. Her father, clearly nervous despite his attempts to project aristocratic ease, offered refreshments that were politely declined. Benedict's manner was courteous but businesslike, and when he suggested that perhaps they might speak privately about the matter at hand, Lord Harrington's relief was palpable. They settled into their seats, her father in his favourite chair near the window, Celeste on the settee, and Benedict in the wing-back chair opposite them. There was a moment of weighted silence as the Duke regarded them both with that penetrating gaze that seemed to catalogue and evaluate everything it encountered. Then he began to speak, and with his first words, Celeste felt the romantic illusions of the previous evening begin to crumble like sand castles before an incoming tide. Benedict laid out his requirements with the precision of a military general planning a campaign. He needed a wife who could manage his 4 estates, Ravensshire Manor in Kent, Greyridge Hall in Yorkshire, Thornfield House in Cornwall, and his London residence in Mayfair. Each property required constant oversight, coordination of staff, management of social obligations, and navigation of the complex web of relationships that bound the aristocracy together. His grandmother, the formidable Dowager Duchess Augusta, was aging and could no longer handle these responsibilities as she once had. His unmarried state had become a liability in both social and political circles, where a duke without a duchess was viewed with suspicion and considered incomplete. He had chosen Celeste, he explained with clinical detachment, because her maturity and demonstrated capability in managing her own family's complex household affairs marked her as uniquely qualified for the position. Unlike the fresh-faced debutantes who populated London's ballrooms, she would understand from the outset that theirs would be a partnership of mutual benefit rather than a romantic entanglement. She would not harbor expectations of grand gestures or passionate declarations that would complicate what was essentially a practical arrangement. She had already proven herself capable of sacrifice and discretion, qualities he valued above conventional beauty or youthful charm. Her father listened with growing comprehension and poorly concealed delight. When Benedict mentioned that he was prepared to settle the entire Harrington debt immediately upon their engagement, some £15,000 that Lord Edmund had accumulated through failed investments and gambling losses, Celeste watched her father's face transform with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. Throughout this recitation of terms and conditions, Celeste sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to prevent them from trembling. She understood what was being offered: salvation for her family, security for her sisters, an end to the constant anxiety that had shadowed their household for years. She also understood what was being withheld: any pretense of affection, any possibility of romantic love, any hope that she might be chosen for herself rather than for her utility. When Benedict finally turned to her directly, his expression softened marginally, though his words remained matter-of-fact. He asked if she understood the nature of what he was proposing, if she found the arrangement acceptable, if she would consent to become his duchess under these clearly defined terms. He promised her respect, security, and the full dignity of her position. He would be a faithful husband, an attentive partner in all practical matters, and would ensure she wanted for nothing material. What he could not promise, what he made clear from the outset, was the sort of passionate devotion that novels romanticized and young girls dreamed of receiving. Celeste met his gaze steadily, drawing upon years of practiced composure to keep her voice from betraying the complicated tangle of emotions roiling within her. She accepted his proposal with quiet dignity, thanking him for his honesty and assuring him that she understood perfectly the nature of their arrangement. She would be honored to become his duchess and would dedicate herself completely to fulfilling the responsibilities of that role. If her voice wavered slightly on the final words, neither man seemed to notice. Her father's enthusiastic consent was immediate and effusive. Papers would be drawn up, settlements arranged, announcements sent to the newspapers. Benedict suggested a brief engagement of 6 weeks, time enough to satisfy propriety without the prolonged spectacle of a lengthy courtship. The wedding would be held at his London residence rather than a cathedral, an elegant but restrained affair befitting a union of mature individuals rather than starry-eyed youth. As the Duke rose to take his leave, pressing a chaste kiss to Celeste's gloved hand and promising to call again in 2 days' time to discuss practical arrangements, she felt a small fracture form somewhere deep in her chest. She had entered this drawing room as a woman who had given up on romantic dreams years ago, resigned to spinsterhood and satisfied with her role as guardian of her sister's happiness. Yet some small, stubborn part of her heart had apparently survived, had dared to hope that the Duke's dramatic gesture at the ball might mean something more than calculated strategy. That fragile hope died quietly as Benedict departed, his footsteps echoing down the hallway with the finality of a closing door. Her father was already planning how to deploy the Duke's money, which debts to settle first, how to secure advantageous matches for Clara and Lillian now that the family's financial troubles would be resolved. Celeste listened to his animated chatter with half her attention, nodding at appropriate intervals while the reality of her future settled over her like a heavy cloak. She would be a duchess, but never beloved. Respected, but never desired. Secure, but never cherished. It was more than she had any right to expect, more than most women in her position could dream of achieving. She should be grateful, and she was grateful, truly. Yet as she sat in the drawing room of her father's modest townhouse, sunlight slanting across the worn carpet and the sounds of London filtering through the windows, Celeste allowed herself one moment of private grief for the marriage she would never have. Then she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and prepared herself to become the perfect duchess that Benedict Ravenshire required, capable, composed, and entirely unencumbered by inconvenient romantic expectations. And so the bargain was struck. Her family would be saved. And if the price was her own heart's desires, well, she had been paying such prices for years. This was simply the final, largest payment in a long series of sacrifices. At least this time, she told herself firmly, she would have a title and security to show for it. The announcement in the Times sent shockwaves through London society that reverberated for weeks. The Duke of Ravensshire, one of England's most distinguished noblemen, was to marry Miss Celeste Harrington, the eldest daughter of Lord Edmund Harrington. No mention was made of her age, of course, but everyone in society knew precisely how many seasons the overlooked Miss Harrington had endured in the shadows while her younger sisters claimed the spotlight. The drawing rooms of Mayfair buzzed with speculation. Lady Pemberton declared it the most shocking misalliance of the decade, convinced that some hidden scandal must explain why a Duke of Ravenshire's standing would bypass her beautiful Dorothea for a woman on the shelf. The Duchess of Marlborough, however, pronounced it admirably practical, noting that a man of Benedict's position required a wife of sense and capability rather than a simpering girl who would swoon at the first sign of difficulty. Others whispered about secret love affairs, hidden connections, or desperate financial arrangements that might explain the inexplicable match. Celeste bore the scrutiny with the same quiet dignity she had cultivated over years of being overlooked. She attended the necessary social calls with Benedict at her side, endured the barely concealed curiosity of matrons who examined her as though searching for some magical quality that could explain her improbable triumph. Through it all, Benedict remained unfailingly courteous, his hand steady at her elbow, his manner projecting absolute certainty in his choice. If he heard the whispers, he gave no indication that they troubled him in the slightest. The 6 weeks of their engagement passed in a blur of arrangements and preparations. Celeste spent hours with the modiste, being fitted for a trousseau befitting a duchess, though she insisted on styles that reflected her own taste rather than the elaborate confections that younger brides might favor. She met with Benedict's solicitors to understand the legal complexities of the settlements, listened attentively as his steward explained the responsibilities she would assume at each estate, and studied the intricate family trees and social connections she would need to navigate as the Duchess of Ravensshire. Benedict called regularly but always with purpose, to discuss household arrangements, to introduce her to key members of his staff, to ensure she understood what would be expected of her. Their conversations were cordial and productive, marked by mutual respect and a growing appreciation for each other's pragmatic approach to their situation. Yet they never strayed into personal territory, never ventured beyond the practical boundaries he had established in that first meeting. Celeste learned his preferences in household management and his expectations for social entertaining, but she learned nothing of his dreams or fears or the thoughts that occupied his mind during quiet moments. The wedding itself took place on a mild morning in late April at Benedict's London residence, an elegant townhouse in Grosvenor Square. The ceremony was held in the library rather than a cathedral, attended by only the immediate families and a select group of close acquaintances. Celeste wore a gown of ivory silk with delicate silver embroidery, elegant in its simplicity, and carried a bouquet of white roses from the Ravensshire hothouses. Her sisters served as her attendants, their faces glowing with genuine happiness for her unexpected good fortune, though Clara had whispered before the ceremony that she wished their mother could have lived to see this day. As Celeste stood before the Archbishop and repeated her vows, she was acutely conscious of the distance between the words she spoke and the reality she was entering. She promised to love, honor, and cherish, knowing that only two of those three would be reciprocated. Benedict's voice was steady and sure as he made his own vows, his hand warm and strong as he slipped the heavy Ravensshire signet ring onto her finger. When the Archbishop pronounced them man and wife, Benedict kissed her with appropriate reverence but no passion, a formal seal on a formal contract. The wedding breakfast was refined and brief, held in the grand dining room with its soaring ceilings and priceless artwork. Toasts were offered by her father and Benedict's closest friend, Lord Ashworth, who spoke of the Duke's wisdom in choosing a bride of substance and character. The Dowager Duchess Augusta, Benedict's formidable grandmother, surveyed Celeste with shrewd eyes throughout the meal and pronounced herself cautiously optimistic about the match, which everyone understood to be high praise from a woman not known for lavish compliments. By early afternoon, Celeste found herself seated in Benedict's luxurious travelling carriage, leaving London behind as they began the journey to Ravensshire Manor in Kent. Her husband sat across from her rather than beside her, reading correspondence that his secretary had prepared, occasionally glancing out the window at the passing countryside. The silence between them was not uncomfortable precisely, but it was profound, weighted with all the things neither of them was saying. They arrived at Ravensshire Manor as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, bathing the magnificent estate in golden light. Celeste's breath caught at her first sight of her new home, a sprawling Jacobean manor house of honey-colored stone, set amid rolling parkland dotted with ancient oaks. Formal gardens stretched in geometric precision near the house, while in the distance she could see the silver glint of a lake and the darker shadows of woodland beyond. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a testament to centuries of wealth and careful stewardship. The household staff assembled in the entrance hall to greet their new duchess, a sea of curious faces ranging from the dignified butler to the youngest scullery maid. Benedict introduced her to the senior staff with formal courtesy, then showed her through the principal rooms, the grand saloon with its painted ceiling, the dining room that could seat 40, the music room with its broadwood pianoforte, the portrait gallery where generations of Ravensshire dukes and duchesses gazed down from gilded frames. Her private apartments were in the east wing, a suite of rooms decorated in soft blues and creams with views over the gardens. They were beautiful, spacious, and utterly separate from Benedict's own chambers in the west wing. As the housekeeper showed her the dressing room, the sitting room, and the bedchamber with its canopied bed, Celeste understood the physical manifestation of the emotional distance Benedict maintained. There would be no shared quarters, no casual intimacy of daily proximity. They would meet for meals, for social obligations, for the practical discussions necessary to manage the estate, but their personal lives would remain precisely that, separate and personal. That night, after the staff had withdrawn and she sat alone in her new bedchamber, still wearing her traveling dress because she couldn't quite bring herself to change into nightclothes, Celeste allowed herself to fully comprehend her situation. She was the Duchess of Ravensshire, mistress of one of England's finest estates, secure in position and fortune beyond anything she could have imagined mere weeks ago. Her sisters would make brilliant matches, her father's debts were settled, and she would never again face the prospect of poverty or dependence. Yet as she looked around the beautiful room that was now hers, surrounded by luxury but entirely alone, Celeste felt the profound loneliness of her position settle into her bones. She had gained everything society valued and lost something she hadn't realized she still possessed. The small, foolish hope that someone might someday choose to truly know her, not for what she could do but for who she was. She was a duchess in title, respected in position, and utterly isolated in heart. The bargain had been fulfilled precisely as promised, and she would honor it with grace and capability. But as the candles burned low and the great house settled into silence around her, Celeste understood that the most difficult part of her new life would not be managing estates or navigating society, but rather learning to live with the constant ache of standing so close to a man she was beginning to respect deeply while knowing she would never truly reach him. Celeste awoke her first morning as Duchess of Ravensshire to the sound of birdsong filtering through the tall windows of her bedchamber. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, she lay still beneath the fine linen sheets, taking in the painted ceiling above her and the morning light that gilded everything it touched. Then reality settled over her with the weight of her new responsibilities, and she rose with determined purpose. If she could not claim her husband's heart, she would at least prove worthy of his choice in every other respect. The household staff had assembled in the servants' hall for their first formal meeting with the new Duchess, their faces carefully neutral but their eyes revealing varying degrees of skepticism. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who had served the Ravensshire family for 30 years, stood at the forefront with the ramrod posture of a general preparing for inspection. The butler, Morrison, maintained an expression of dignified reserve that bordered on disapproval. Behind them ranged the footmen, maids, kitchen staff, and outdoor servants, dozens of individuals whose cooperation she would need to earn rather than simply command by virtue of her new title. Celeste addressed them without notes or prepared speech, her voice calm and clear as she acknowledged the peculiarity of her position. She did not pretend to have been born to this role or to possess inherent knowledge of managing an estate of Ravenshire's magnitude. Instead, she spoke plainly of her intention to learn, to listen, and to work alongside them in maintaining the standards of excellence for which the household was known. She asked for their patience as she familiarized herself with their established routines, promised to respect the systems they had perfected over years of service, and made clear that she valued competence and dedication above blind obedience. The speech was met with polite applause that held more form than enthusiasm, but Celeste had not expected immediate acceptance. Trust, like respect, would need to be earned through action rather than words. She spent the following weeks in systematic study of every aspect of the household's operation. With Mrs. Pemberton as her guide, she learned the intricacies of managing a staff of over 60 servants, the seasonal rhythms of estate maintenance, and the complex web of supplier relationships that kept such a vast establishment running smoothly. She rose early to inspect the kitchens, consulted with the head gardener about the restoration of the rose garden that had been neglected during the dowager's declining health, and spent hours poring over the household accounts with a precision that surprised even Morrison's cynical eye. The first test of her capabilities came when the annual midsummer garden party was announced, a tradition that brought the local gentry and neighboring estates together for an afternoon of refined entertainment. The event had been organized by the Dowager Duchess for decades, and the staff watched with barely concealed anxiety to see how the new, inexperienced Duchess would handle such a significant undertaking. Celeste approached the challenge as she had approached every difficulty in her life, with methodical planning and careful attention to detail. She consulted the previous year's records, sought advice from Mrs. Pemberton on what had worked well and what might be improved, and then set about coordinating the myriad elements required for success. She personally oversaw the arrangement of the refreshment tables, ensured that accommodations were made for elderly guests who might struggle with the garden paths, and created a program of entertainment that balanced tradition with subtle innovation. On the day of the party, as 300 guests strolled through Ravenshire's magnificent gardens beneath a perfect June sky, Celeste moved through the crowd with quiet grace. She remembered names and connections, inquired after ailing relatives with genuine concern, and managed to make each guest feel particularly welcomed. When Lady Thornbury, the most formidable matron in the county, pronounced the event superior to any she had attended in recent memory, Celeste caught Mrs. Pemberton's small smile of approval and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer sun. Benedict, who had observed the entire affair with his characteristic reserve, waited until the last carriage had departed before seeking her out in the now empty garden. He found her supervising the servants as they began the clean-up, her hair slightly disheveled from the long day but her bearing still composed. "You managed that remarkably well," he said, and though his tone remained formal, there was something in his eyes that might have been the beginning of genuine regard. "My grandmother would have been pleased." It was a small compliment, delivered without flourish, but Celeste felt it settle around her heart like a warm cloak. She thanked him with equal restraint, and they walked together back to the house in companionable silence, the evening air sweet with the scent of roses. The servants' attitudes shifted gradually over the following months, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. They noticed how the Duchess never asked them to perform tasks she wouldn't do herself, how she learned each of their names and something of their circumstances, how she defended the kitchen maid who had accidentally broken a valuable vase against Morrison's suggestion of dismissal. When young Thomas, one of the footmen, received news of his mother's serious illness, it was the Duchess who arranged for him to return home with paid leave and a hamper of supplies from the estate. Mrs. Pemberton, won over by Celeste's genuine respect for the household's established order and her willingness to learn, became an invaluable ally. Morrison, more slowly convinced, eventually admitted to the housekeeper that the Duchess possessed qualities of leadership that transcended her unexpected origins. Throughout the staff, a quiet consensus emerged. Whatever doubts they had harbored about their new mistress, she had proven herself worthy of her position through dedication, capability, and unfailing kindness. Yet it was in the evenings that the most significant transformation began, so subtle that neither Celeste nor Benedict fully recognized it at first. It started simply enough. Benedict had always spent his evenings in the library, attending to correspondence or reading among the thousands of volumes that lined the walls. Celeste, seeking a quiet space to occupy her own evening hours, began bringing her needlework to the library rather than sitting alone in her chambers. The first night she entered, Benedict had looked up from his book with mild surprise, but he simply nodded acknowledgement and returned to his reading. She settled into a chair near the fireplace and worked on her embroidery in silence. The pattern repeated the following evening, and the one after that. A week passed, then two, and what had begun as parallel solitude gradually transformed into something approaching companionship. Occasionally, one would read a particularly striking passage aloud, testing the thought against the other's reaction. Benedict discovered that Celeste possessed a sharp analytical mind and a breadth of reading that surprised him. She had educated herself through years of borrowing books from Lady Evelyn's extensive library, and her insights on philosophy and literature revealed depths he hadn't anticipated. Their conversations, when they occurred, ranged from discussions of political economy to debates about the Romantic poets, from theological questions to speculation about scientific discoveries. Benedict found himself looking forward to these evening exchanges, to the way Celeste's mind engaged with complex ideas without pretension or affectation. She challenged his assumptions without being combative, offered perspectives he hadn't considered, and listened with genuine attention when he articulated his own thoughts. For her part, Celeste began to see beyond the reserved exterior Benedict presented to the world. In these quiet hours, with only the crackling fire and the soft lamplight surrounding them, he occasionally revealed glimpses of the man beneath the Duke, his dry humor, his passionate convictions about land reform, his surprising knowledge of architectural history, his admission that he found most social gatherings exhausting rather than enjoyable. She learned that he rode out alone each morning not from preference for solitude, but because it was the only time he felt free from the weight of expectation that accompanied his title. One evening in late autumn, as rain lashed against the windows and they sat closer to the fire than usual, Benedict set down his book and regarded her thoughtfully. The silence stretched between them, but it felt different from the careful distance he had maintained in their early weeks of marriage, charged somehow, weighted with unspoken recognition. "I find I look forward to these evenings," he said finally, his voice quiet but clear. "Your company has become the most pleasant part of my day." Celeste's needle stilled in her hands as she looked up at him, searching his face for the meaning behind words that seemed almost daringly personal coming from a man who had promised her only respect and distance. His expression remained composed, but something in his eyes suggested vulnerability she had never seen before. "I find the same, Your Grace," she replied softly, then added with careful honesty, "I appreciate that you are willing to share your thoughts with me. It means more than you might realize." He nodded slowly, seeming to weigh her words, then picked up his book again. But Celeste noticed that he glanced in her direction several more times that evening, and when she bid him good night and retired to her separate chambers, she carried with her the fragile but growing hope that perhaps their carefully constructed boundaries were beginning to shift, not dramatically, but with the slow inevitability of seasons changing, of ice yielding to warming sun. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning, its heavy cream parchment bearing the distinctive seal of the Dowager Duchess Augusta. Celeste recognized the authoritative script before Morrison even presented it on the silver salver, and she felt a flutter of apprehension as she broke the wax seal. The Dowager was coming to Ravenshire for an extended visit, arriving within the week to properly assess the new Duchess she had only briefly met at the wedding. Benedict found her in the morning room an hour later, the letter still in her hands, her expression composed but her tension evident in the rigid set of her shoulders. He read the missive without comment, then set it aside with what might have been the ghost of sympathy in his eyes. "My grandmother can be rather formidable," he acknowledged, his tone carefully neutral. "She has very particular expectations about what constitutes proper behavior for a Duchess of Ravensshire." Celeste nodded, already mentally cataloguing everything she would need to review: proper forms of address, the intricacies of precedence at formal dinners, the subtle distinctions in court protocol that she had studied but never put into practice. She would need to be perfect, to prove herself worthy of a title that had been held by women of impeccable breeding for generations. That evening in the library, as Celeste sat with an etiquette manual rather than her usual book, Benedict looked up from his correspondence with uncharacteristic directness. He watched her for a long moment, taking in the determined concentration on her face, the way she made careful notes in the margins of her notebook. "Celeste," he said quietly, and she startled slightly at his use of her given name rather than the formal address he typically employed. "My grandmother is indeed exacting, but she values authenticity above all else. She can detect falseness at 50 paces and despises obsequiousness in any form. The best way to earn her respect is simply to be yourself, the capable, intelligent woman you have proven to be since arriving at Ravensshire." The unexpected tenderness in his voice, the gentle encouragement, sent warmth spreading through Celeste's chest. She met his gaze and saw something in his expression that she had glimpsed only occasionally in recent weeks, a softness that suggested he cared about more than just whether she performed her duties adequately. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I shall try to remember that when I'm terrified she's about to pronounce me entirely unsuitable." Benedict's lips curved into what was unmistakably a smile, rare and transformative. "If she does, I shall simply inform her that I find you entirely suitable and that her opinion, while valued, will not alter my position on the matter." The Dowager Duchess Augusta arrived precisely on schedule, her travelling carriage bearing the Ravensshire arms and accompanied by an entourage of servants that temporarily doubled the household's population. She descended from the carriage with the regal bearing of a woman who had been born to nobility and had spent 7 decades reinforcing her position at its apex. At 75, she remained formidable, tall and unbowed, with silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure and keen grey eyes that missed nothing. Celeste received her in the grand entrance hall, curtsying with the precise depth appropriate for a dowager duchess, her own bearing reflecting the confidence she had developed over months of managing Ravensshire. Augusta's assessment was immediate and thorough, her gaze travelling from Celeste's simply styled hair to her elegant but understated gown, cataloguing and evaluating with the efficiency of a military inspector. "So you are the mysterious Miss Harrington who somehow captured my grandson's attention," Augusta said, her voice carrying the aristocratic drawl of the previous century. "I confess myself intensely curious about how such an unexpected match came to pass." The comment was clearly designed to unsettle, to test whether Celeste would fumble for explanations or become defensive. Instead, she met the dowager's gaze with calm directness and offered the truth without embellishment. His Grace required a wife capable of managing his estates and navigating the complexities of his position, and he believed I possessed the necessary qualities despite my unconventional background. I have endeavored to prove his judgment sound. Augusta's eyebrows rose slightly, but whether in approval or further skepticism remained unclear. The afternoon passed in a tour of the house and grounds, during which the dowager subjected every arrangement to scrutiny. She inspected the household accounts, examined the condition of the silver, tested the servants' knowledge of their duties, and evaluated the improvements Celeste had implemented in the gardens. Throughout it all, she offered no compliments but occasionally issued small sounds that might have indicated satisfaction or might simply have been acknowledgement. The formal dinner that evening was an ordeal Celeste had been dreading since the letter's arrival. Seated at the long mahogany table with Benedict at one end and the dowager at the other, she felt the weight of Augusta's attention like a physical pressure. The conversation ranged across topics designed to test her knowledge: current political developments, the intricacies of estate management, the genealogies of prominent families, the proper protocols for court presentation. Celeste answered each question honestly and directly, neither pretending to knowledge she didn't possess nor apologizing for the gaps in her aristocratic education. When asked about her approach to managing the household staff, she spoke frankly about learning from Mrs. Pemberton's experience rather than imposing her own untested ideas. When the dowager mentioned that the rose garden looked better than it had in years, Celeste gave credit to the head gardener's expertise rather than claiming the achievement as her own. It was during a discussion of agricultural reforms that the evening's pivotal moment arrived. Augusta expressed strong opinions about modernization being pursued at the expense of traditional methods, her tone suggesting she expected automatic agreement from a woman who should defer to her elders' wisdom. Celeste, however, had spent considerable time with Benedict's estate manager and had read extensively on the subject. "With respect, Your Grace, I must respectfully disagree," Celeste said calmly, setting down her wine glass with deliberate care. "While traditional methods certainly have their place and should not be discarded without careful consideration, the new crop rotation systems have demonstrably improved yields on several neighboring estates. I believe we would be remiss not to at least conduct trials on a portion of our acreage to determine whether the benefits might outweigh the risks of change." The silence that followed was profound. Benedict's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes widening slightly. The footmen standing against the wall seemed to hold their collective breath. Augusta stared at Celeste with an intensity that suggested she was re-evaluating everything she had concluded about this unexpected duchess. Then, impossibly, the dowager's severe expression softened into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. She set down her own glass with a decisive clink and regarded Celeste with what could only be described as satisfaction. "Finally," Augusta declared, her voice carrying clearly through the dining room, "a woman with a spine. Benedict, I believe you may have chosen more wisely than I initially credited. This one will not be bullied by society matrons or intimidated by those who believe birth outweighs capability." The remainder of the dinner passed in considerably warmer atmosphere. Augusta engaged Celeste in genuine conversation rather than interrogation, sharing stories of her own early days as a young duchess and offering observations about navigating the complexities of aristocratic life with refreshing candor. By the time dessert was served, she had pronounced Celeste acceptable, which everyone understood to be extraordinary praise from a woman not known for lavish compliments. Later that evening, after the dowager had retired to her chambers and the house had settled into quiet, Celeste found herself once again in the library. Benedict was already there, standing by the window and gazing out at the moonlit grounds. When she entered, He turned to face her, and his expression held something she had never quite seen before: pride mixed with genuine warmth, the reserve that usually characterized his demeanor softened by unmistakable affection. He crossed the room to where she stood, stopping close enough that she could see the lamplight reflected in his eyes. Then, in a gesture so unexpected it nearly stole her breath, he reached out and took her hand in his, not the formal touch of courtesy they had exchanged at their wedding, but something far more intimate. His thumb brushed gently across her knuckles as he held her gaze. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a depth of feeling that resonated through her. "You were magnificent tonight. My grandmother is not easily impressed, and you not only met her formidable standards but exceeded them by remaining entirely yourself. I am grateful for your courage and your honesty." Celeste felt tears prick at her eyes, though she blinked them back determinedly. His hand was warm around hers, and she could feel her pulse quickening at the unprecedented intimacy of the moment. This was not the polite distance he had maintained throughout their marriage, not the careful boundaries he had established. This was something different, something that felt perilously close to genuine tenderness. "I had an excellent teacher who reminded me that authenticity matters more than performance," she replied softly, allowing her fingers to curve slightly around his. "Your grandmother is formidable, but I understand better now why her approval matters to you." They stood there in the lamplight, hands joined, the space between them charged with possibilities neither quite dared to name. Then Benedict squeezed her hand gently once more before releasing it, stepping back with visible reluctance. But as he bid her good night and she made her way to her separate chambers, Celeste carried with her something precious and fragile, the first genuine flutter of hope that the careful architecture of their practical arrangement might be shifting into something neither of them had anticipated, something that felt dangerously close to the beginnings of real affection. Clara arrived at Ravenshire on a grey November afternoon, her travelling carriage appearing through the bare trees like a ghost emerging from mist. Celeste had been expecting her younger sister's visit with eagerness tempered by the vague unease that had accompanied Clara's letter requesting an invitation. The tone had been warm but carried an undercurrent of concern that set Celeste's instincts on edge. She greeted Clara in the entrance hall with genuine affection, embracing her sister with a warmth that transcended the formal courtesies demanded by their changed circumstances. Clara had always been her favorite, the sister whose temperament most closely matched her own, thoughtful where Lillian was frivolous, observant where their father was willfully blind. Now, as Celeste studied Clara's face, she recognized the subtle signs of worry in the tightness around her eyes and the forced brightness of her smile. The first evening passed pleasantly enough. They dined together in the small family dining room rather than the imposing formal space, with Benedict proving an attentive host who drew Clara out with thoughtful questions about her recent season and her impressions of the latest theatrical productions in London. Celeste watched the interaction with quiet satisfaction, noting how Benedict's natural reserve softened in this more intimate setting, how he actually seemed to enjoy the conversation rather than merely tolerating it as social obligation. It was only after Benedict had excused himself to attend to correspondence, leaving the sisters alone in the drawing room with tea and the crackling fire, that Clara's facade finally crumbled. She set down her cup with trembling hands and turned to Celeste with an expression of mingled distress and determination. "I need to tell you something that's being said in London," Clara began, her voice low despite their privacy. "I debated whether to speak of it at all, but I decided you deserve to know what rumors are circulating about your marriage." The unease that had been lurking at the edges of Celeste's consciousness crystallized into something sharper and more painful. She set aside her own tea and folded her hands in her lap, steeling herself for whatever was to come. Clara spoke carefully, laying out the gossip that had been spreading through London's drawing rooms like poison seeping into groundwater. Lady Penelope Winter, the beautiful and accomplished daughter of the Earl of Ashford, had been systematically undermining Celeste's position with calculated precision. Penelope had been widely expected to become the Duchess of Ravensshire. Her breeding was impeccable, her dowry substantial, her beauty legendary throughout the ton. Benedict had paid her marked attention during several seasons, and society had simply been waiting for the inevitable announcement. Then he had shocked everyone by choosing Celeste instead, and Penelope's wounded pride had apparently transformed into something far more dangerous than disappointment. She was now telling anyone who would listen that the Ravensshire marriage was nothing more than a convenient arrangement, a practical solution to Benedict's need for competent household management. Celeste, according to Penelope's carefully constructed narrative, was merely an efficient housekeeper playing at being Duchess, a temporary solution until Benedict tired of the charade and sought his pleasures elsewhere, as men of his position inevitably did. The words were designed to cut, and they found their marks with devastating accuracy. Penelope suggested that Benedict had chosen Celeste precisely because she would make no emotional demands, would accept his eventual infidelities with grateful silence, would manage his estates while he pursued more stimulating companionship with women of his own social sphere. The whispers implied that Celeste's advanced age and modest origins made her grateful enough for the title that she would tolerate any indignity rather than risk losing her elevated position. As Clara spoke, Celeste felt each revelation like a physical blow, not because the rumors were unexpected, she had anticipated society's skepticism, but because they articulated fears she had been trying desperately to suppress. The seeds of doubt that had been planted during Benedict's clinical proposal now found fertile ground in her imagination. Had the warmth she thought she detected in recent weeks been genuine, or merely courtesy? Was his hand-holding after the Dowager's visit a moment of true connection, or simple gratitude for a task well performed? Did he see her as a partner who might eventually claim his heart, or merely as a competent employee who happened to bear his name? Clara reached across the space between them and grasped Celeste's hands, her grip fierce with protective loyalty. She insisted that the rumors were nothing more than jealous spite from a woman who couldn't bear to lose what she had considered her rightful prize. More importantly, Clara had spent the past 2 days observing Benedict and Celeste together, and she had seen things that gave her hope. "The way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching," Clara said earnestly, her eyes bright with conviction. "There's something in his expression that I've never seen directed at any other woman, including Lady Penelope during all those seasons she pursued him. It's not mere respect or gratitude, Celeste. There's tenderness there, and something that looks remarkably like affection that's still finding its way to the surface." She described small moments she had witnessed, how Benedict's gaze had followed Celeste across the dining room, how his posture had relaxed when she entered the library, how he had smiled at something she said with genuine amusement rather than polite courtesy, how his hand had lingered on her chair when helping her rise from the table. These were not the behaviors of a man maintaining a purely practical arrangement, Clara insisted, but of someone whose carefully constructed boundaries were beginning to crumble despite his best efforts at restraint. Celeste wanted desperately to believe her sister's observations, to trust that the connection she had begun to feel between herself and Benedict was real rather than wishful imagination. Yet Penelope's words had awakened the old insecurities that she thought she had overcome, the conviction that she was valuable only for what she could do rather than who she was, that her worth lay in competence rather than desirability, that she should be grateful for scraps of attention rather than hoping for genuine devotion. They talked late into the night, Clara offering reassurance while Celeste struggled to articulate fears that felt both irrational and terrifyingly plausible. By the time they retired to their respective chambers, some of Celeste's turmoil had eased, soothed by her sister's conviction and her own desire to believe that what had been growing between her and Benedict over recent months was authentic rather than imagined. Yet sleep proved elusive. Celeste lay awake in her solitary bed, staring at the canopy above her while her mind replayed every interaction with Benedict, searching for evidence to support either hope or fear. The warmth of his hand holding hers, the tenderness in his voice when he encouraged her before the Dowager's visit, the way his reserve seemed to soften during their library evenings, were these signs of genuine affection taking root, or merely the courteous behavior of a well-bred gentleman toward a useful employee? The worst part was knowing that she had violated the fundamental terms of their arrangement. Benedict had chosen her specifically because she wouldn't harbor romantic expectations, wouldn't complicate their practical partnership with messy emotions and inconvenient desires. Yet somewhere between managing his estates and sharing quiet evenings in the library, she had committed the ultimate foolishness. She had begun to fall in love with her husband. And if Penelope's rumors reached Benedict, if he realized that Celeste had developed the very feelings he had sought to avoid, would he retreat back behind the walls of formality they had so carefully constructed? Would the fragile warmth between them freeze over, replaced by the polite distance of their early weeks together? The questions circled through her mind like ravens, offering no answers, only growing anxiety about what the morning might bring. She had proven herself capable of managing Ravenshire, of earning the staff's respect and the dowager's approval, of fulfilling every practical aspect of her role as Duchess. But she had no idea how to protect herself from the far more dangerous challenge of hoping for something more, of wanting not just to be valued for her competence, but to be chosen for herself, to be not merely respected but genuinely loved. As the grey dawn began to lighten her windows, Celeste finally drifted into restless sleep, unaware that events were already in motion that would force every unspoken feeling between her and Benedict into the unforgiving light of day. Lady Penelope Winter, it seemed, was not content with spreading rumors from the safety of London's drawing rooms. She had decided that a personal visit to Ravenshire Manor was long overdue, and her carriage was already on the road from the capital, bearing her toward a confrontation that would test the foundations of everything Celeste had worked to build. Lady Penelope Winter arrived at Ravenshire Manor 2 days after Clara's departure, her timing so precise that Celeste couldn't help but suspect it had been deliberately calculated. The footman announced her with visible uncertainty, clearly aware that an unmarried lady arriving unannounced at a gentleman's estate violated every standard of propriety, yet unable to turn away the daughter of an earl who claimed to be merely passing through the area and requesting brief hospitality. Celeste received her in the drawing-room, her composure carefully maintained despite the shock of finding her husband's former, almost betrothed standing in her home. Penelope was everything the rumors had suggested, breathtakingly beautiful with golden hair arranged in the latest fashion, a figure that her traveling dress displayed to perfection, and an air of aristocratic confidence that came from knowing she had been born to occupy the highest levels of society. She moved through the room with the easy grace of someone who had never questioned her right to be anywhere she chose, her blue eyes taking in every detail with calculating assessment. The superficial courtesies were observed with scrupulous attention to form. Celeste ordered refreshments, inquired politely about Penelope's journey, and expressed appropriate concern about the unexpected nature of her visit. Penelope responded with equal politeness, all while managing to convey through tone and subtle emphasis that she found the entire situation rather amusing, the nouveau duchess playing hostess to the woman who should have held that position. When Benedict entered the drawing-room, summoned by Morrison with a message that they had an unexpected guest, his expression underwent a transformation that Celeste had never witnessed before. The warmth that had begun to characterize his demeanor in recent weeks vanished instantly, replaced by a coldness that made the November air outside seem tropical by comparison. His greeting to Penelope was correct but frigid, and Celeste saw his jaw tighten with what appeared to be barely suppressed anger. Yet Penelope seemed undeterred by his obvious displeasure. She launched into what could only be described as a carefully orchestrated performance, reminding Benedict of shared experiences from previous seasons with a kind of intimate detail that suggested deep familiarity. She referenced a particular evening at Vauxhall Gardens where they had watched fireworks together, a discussion they had shared about Italian art at the Royal Academy, his stated preference for morning rides through Hyde Park rather than afternoon carriage processions. Each memory was delivered with calculated casualness, designed to emphasize the years of connection between them while highlighting Celeste's status as a recent and essentially superficial addition to Benedict's life. The assault was subtle but relentless. Penelope spoke of mutual acquaintances and shared jokes that Celeste couldn't possibly understand, referenced social events at which she and Benedict had been the center of attention, and made delicate allusions to conversations of such personal nature that they suggested an intimacy far beyond what propriety should have allowed. Throughout it all, she maintained an expression of innocent friendliness, as though she were merely catching up with an old companion and meant no harm by excluding the new Duchess from their shared history. Celeste felt each reference like a small cut, death by 1,000 carefully placed wounds. She maintained her composure with the same discipline she had cultivated over years of enduring her family's financial struggles, her face revealing nothing of the turmoil churning beneath her calm exterior. Yet inside, Penelope's words found every insecurity and pressed against them with surgical precision. How could she possibly compete with years of shared history, with a woman who understood Benedict's world from birth, who moved in his social sphere with the ease of belonging rather than the careful study of an outsider trying to learn the rules? The most devastating moment came when Penelope turned her attention directly to Benedict with an expression of theatrical sympathy. She suggested that while his choice to marry for practical considerations was admirable in its own way, surely he must sometimes miss the kind of understanding that could only exist between people of similar background and breeding. Someone like Celeste, no matter how competent at managing households, could never truly comprehend the unique burdens and expectations that came with being born to nobility. It must be rather lonely, Penelope intimated with false compassion, to have sacrificed genuine companionship for efficient estate management. The implication was clear. Celeste was the practical choice, the sensible decision, the useful tool, while Penelope represented what Benedict had given up by choosing duty over desire. She positioned herself as the romantic possibility he had sacrificed, the woman who could have truly understood and matched him in ways that transcended mere competence. Benedict's response, when it came, was delivered with such controlled fury that it made Penelope's confidence waver for the first time. He rose from his chair with deliberate grace, his posture radiating authority as he moved to stand beside Celeste's chair, placing his hand on her shoulder in a gesture of unmistakable unity. "Lady Penelope, I find I must correct several misapprehensions that you appear to be laboring under," he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations of aristocratic command. "My marriage to Celeste was indeed a choice made with careful consideration, but you are profoundly mistaken if you believe it was a sacrifice of anything meaningful. I have found in my wife a partner of intelligence, integrity, and substance, qualities that I value infinitely more than superficial familiarity with social trivialities or the accident of being born into a particular sphere." His hand tightened on Celeste's shoulder, and she felt the warmth of his touch through the fabric of her gown, anchoring her against the assault she had been enduring. Benedict continued with devastating precision, making clear that whatever connection had existed between himself and Penelope in previous years had been nothing more than the polite attentions demanded by social proximity, never approaching anything that could be construed as genuine attachment or understanding. "The bond that I share with my wife is real and deepening daily," he stated with absolute finality. "I would ask that you do not impose upon our hospitality again, as I find your implications both insulting to the Duchess and tiresome in their transparent self-interest. Morrison will ensure you have everything necessary for your immediate departure." The dismissal was absolute and public, delivered before the servants and leaving no room for Penelope to salvage her dignity. Her face flushed with humiliation as she realized her carefully planned assault had not only failed but had backfired spectacularly. She gathered her composure with visible effort, offered the barest curtsy that propriety demanded, and departed with her head high but her eyes glittering with fury and wounded pride. After her carriage had disappeared down the drive, Benedict remained standing beside Celeste's chair, his hand still resting on her shoulder. The drawing-room had fallen silent, and Celeste found herself unable to move, overwhelmed by the fierce protectiveness Benedict had displayed and uncertain what it truly meant. Finally, he moved to face her, kneeling beside her chair in an echo of that first night at the ball. His expression held none of its usual reserve, revealing instead a vulnerability that took her breath away. "I hope you know that nothing she said held any truth," he said quietly, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart pound. "What exists between us may have begun as practical arrangement, but it has become something I value more than I can adequately express. You are not merely competent, Celeste. You are remarkable, and I find myself grateful every day that you chose to accept my admittedly clinical proposal." Celeste felt tears threaten but refused to let them fall, not wanting to break the spell of this moment with its raw honesty. She reached out tentatively and touched his face, allowing herself for the first time to acknowledge the depth of feeling that had been growing between them despite all their careful boundaries. The walls they had built were crumbling, and neither of them seemed inclined to repair them. The decision to return to London for the height of the season was made that same evening, as Benedict and Celeste sat together in the library with the fire crackling between them. He explained his reasoning with the same methodical clarity he had once used to outline their marriage arrangement, but now his words carried a different weight, not the detachment of strategy, but the protective determination of a man defending what had become precious to him. Private assurances, no matter how sincere, would never silence the whispers that Penelope had so carefully cultivated. The tongue respected only what it could witness directly, and Benedict intended to provide a demonstration so unambiguous that even the most dedicated gossips would be forced to acknowledge the genuine nature of their union. They would attend every significant event of the season, and he would show society exactly what Celeste meant to him, consequences to his reputation for reserve be damned. Celeste listened with a mixture of trepidation and hope, aware that this represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. Benedict was proposing to publicly dismantle the careful facade of polite distance they had maintained, to expose feelings that had been growing in the shadows to the full scrutiny of London's judgmental gaze. It was both thrilling and terrifying, made more so by the intensity in his eyes as he spoke, an intensity that suggested his motivations transcended mere damage control. They departed for London within the week, arriving at the Ravenshire townhouse in Grosvenor Square just as the season reached its glittering peak. The timing was deliberate. Every significant family would be in residence, every ballroom would be filled with society's elite, and every action they took would be observed, analyzed, and reported throughout the drawing rooms of Mayfair. The campaign Benedict waged over the following weeks was nothing short of revolutionary for a man known throughout society for his emotional restraint. At Lady Pemberton's ball, he danced with Celeste 3 times, a number that bordered on scandalous declaration of particular attachment. At the theatre, he kept her hand tucked in the crook of his arm throughout the entire performance, his attention divided between the stage and her profile, as though he found her reactions more fascinating than the professional actors. At Lady Thornbury's musicale, he sat beside her rather than among the gentlemen, and his pride in her thoughtful observations about the performances was evident to everyone watching. The Ton, accustomed to viewing the Ravenshire marriage as one of cold practicality, found itself forced to recalibrate its collective understanding. Whispers shifted from mockery to confusion to grudging acknowledgement that perhaps they had misjudged the situation entirely. The Duke's attention to his wife was not the dutiful courtesy of a man fulfilling social obligations, but the devoted focus of someone genuinely captivated by his companion. Celeste found herself navigating this new reality with a mixture of wonder and adjustment. Benedict's public displays of affection were restrained by the standards of passionate romance but revolutionary by the standards of his previous behavior. He sought her opinion on political matters in mixed company, deferred to her judgment on social arrangements, and made it abundantly clear through countless small gestures that he valued her partnership in every aspect of their lives. The effect was transformative, not just on society's perception but on Celeste's own understanding of what their marriage had become. Yet despite these public declarations, they had not yet crossed the final boundary that remained between them. Their chambers at the London townhouse were as separate as those at Ravenshire Manor, and while Benedict's manner toward her had warmed considerably, he had not presumed to claim the physical intimacy that was his right as her husband. The tension between what was publicly displayed and privately withheld created an almost unbearable awareness between them, a constant current of unspoken desire and uncertainty. The pivotal moment came at Lady Evelyn's ball, held in her magnificent Mayfair residence on a night when the stars seemed particularly bright above London's smoky skies. The event was one of the season's premier gatherings, attended by everyone of consequence, and Celeste had been looking forward to it with particular pleasure since Lady Evelyn had been such a steadfast friend through all the upheavals of recent months. Benedict had waltzed with her twice already, scandalizing the matrons and delighting the romantics, when he suggested they step out onto the terrace for air. The ballroom had grown warm with the press of bodies, and Celeste accepted gratefully, allowing him to guide her through the French doors into the relative coolness of the November night. The terrace overlooked Lady Evelyn's garden, now bare of summer flowers but beautiful in its architectural bones, illuminated by lanterns that cast dancing shadows across the stone balustrades. Other couples occupied discreet corners, seeking privacy for stolen conversations or forbidden flirtations, but Benedict led Celeste to the far end where they stood alone beneath the stars. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the sounds of the ball muted behind them, the moonlight silvering everything it touched. Benedict's expression held none of the reserve that had once characterized his every interaction, revealing instead a vulnerability and longing that made Celeste's breath catch in her throat. "I need to tell you something that I should have said weeks ago, perhaps months ago," he began, his voice low and rough with emotion. "What began as strategy, as careful calculation and practical arrangement, has become the most genuine connection of my life. You have transformed from the capable solution to my requirements into the woman I find myself thinking about constantly, the presence I seek in every room, the opinion I value above all others." He reached for her hands, holding them with a tenderness that sent warmth spreading through her entire body. The careful walls they had maintained, the boundaries he had insisted upon, were crumbling with every word, and Celeste felt her own defenses dissolving in response. "I chose you for practical reasons," Benedict continued, "but I have come to care for you, to need you, for reasons that transcend anything remotely practical. You make me laugh with your sharp observations, challenge me with your intelligence, humble me with your compassion. When I return to Ravenshire and enter the library, I look for you there first, before the books or correspondence or anything else, because your presence has become essential to my contentment." Celeste felt tears sliding down her cheeks, unable to contain the overwhelming emotion his words evoked. She had hoped, had begun to believe that something real was growing between them, but hearing him articulate it with such raw honesty was almost more than her heart could bear. "I have fallen in love with you, Celeste," he said simply, the declaration all the more powerful for its straightforward delivery. Not as duke to duchess, not as master to the manager of his estates, but as Benedict to Celeste. As a man to the woman who has claimed every part of his heart despite his best efforts to maintain distance. She pulled one hand free from his grasp and touched his face, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her fingertips, the slight roughness of stubble along his jaw. All the words she might have said seemed inadequate to express what she felt, so she offered the simple truth. "I love you too," she whispered. "I tried not to, tried to remember the terms of our arrangement, but somewhere between managing your estates and reading beside you in the library, I lost my heart completely." Benedict's response was to pull her closer, one hand coming up to cradle her face with exquisite gentleness. Then he kissed her, and it was nothing like the chaste brush of lips at their wedding ceremony. This was passion finally unleashed, desire that had been building for months finding expression in the taste and touch and breathless urgency of genuine connection. Celeste responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck, her body pressing against his as though trying to eliminate any distance that remained between them. When they finally drew apart, both breathing heavily, Benedict rested his forehead against hers with a shaky laugh that spoke of profound relief and overwhelming emotion. "We should return to our residence," he said quietly, his meaning unmistakable. "I find I can no longer bear to maintain the fiction of separate chambers. If you are willing, I would like to consummate our marriage not as duty or obligation, but as the physical expression of everything we feel for each other." Celeste's answer was to take his hand and lead him back through the ballroom, pausing only to make their excuses to Lady Evelyn, whose knowing smile suggested she understood perfectly what was occurring. They departed in the Ravensshire carriage with an urgency that made the short journey seem interminable, and when they finally reached their townhouse, Benedict swept her up the stairs to his chambers, not hers, but his, carrying her across the threshold as though she were a bride on her wedding night rather than a wife of 6 months. What followed was the true beginning of their marriage, the consummation not just of physical union but of emotional honesty and genuine devotion. In the darkness of his bedchamber, with only moonlight streaming through the windows, they discovered each other completely, not as Duke and convenient Duchess, but as two people who had found in each other something neither had known they were seeking. The passion was real, the tenderness profound, and when they finally lay entwined in each other's arms as dawn began to lighten the sky, both knew that everything had fundamentally changed. They had entered marriage as a strategic arrangement, but they would move forward as genuine partners bound by love that had grown despite every obstacle they had placed in its path. Spring arrived at Ravensshire Manor with the exuberance of a long-awaited celebration, transforming the grounds into a tapestry of colour and fragrance that seemed to reflect the joy that now permeated the house itself. The rose gardens that Celeste had worked so diligently to restore had exceeded every expectation, blooming in profusion as though nature itself wished to commemorate the transformation that had taken place within the manor's ancient walls. The months following their return from London had been marked by a happiness so profound that Celeste sometimes found herself pausing in the midst of ordinary tasks, overwhelmed by the sheer improbability of her circumstances. The separate chambers that had once symbolized the distance between them now stood empty and unused, as she and Benedict shared not just a bed but every aspect of their lives with an intimacy that transcended the physical. Their evenings in the library continued, but now they sat together on the settee, her head often resting on his shoulder as they read, his fingers absently playing with her hair in gestures of casual affection that would have been unthinkable mere months ago. The household staff had noted the change with satisfaction and approval. Mrs. Pemberton had been heard to remark that she had never seen His Grace so content, while Morrison had unbent enough to smile when observing the Duke and Duchess walking hand in hand through the gardens like young lovers rather than dignified aristocrats. Even the Dowager Duchess Augusta, during her most recent visit, had pronounced herself thoroughly vindicated in her early approval of the match, noting that genuine affection between married partners was far rarer in their circles than it should be. On a particularly beautiful morning in late May, with the gardens at their peak and the air sweet with promise, Benedict suggested they take a walk before breakfast. There was something in his manner, a barely contained excitement mixed with nervous energy, that piqued Celeste's curiosity, but she agreed without question, taking the arm he offered as they descended the terrace steps into the awakening day. He led her along familiar paths, past the formal parterres and through the wilderness garden, until they reached the rose arbor where they had walked on her first day as Duchess of Ravensshire. The structure was now covered in climbing roses of every hue, from the palest blush to the deepest crimson, their combined fragrance almost intoxicating in its intensity. Celeste had chosen each variety carefully, working with the head gardener to create something that would be beautiful across the entire season, and seeing it now in full glory filled her with quiet pride. Benedict stopped beneath the arbor's arch, turning to face her with an expression that held such tenderness it made her breath catch. Then, in a gesture that sent her heart racing with recognition and wonder, he knelt before her on the garden path, not as the Duke before society, but as a man before the woman he loved. From his coat pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring that made Celeste gasp with its beauty. It was nothing like the heavy Ravensshire signet she wore on her right hand, that symbol of duty and position. This was designed specifically for her, a delicate band of gold set with a deep blue sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the morning light and threw rainbows across the roses. It was exquisite and personal, speaking of thought and care and intimate knowledge of her preferences. "When I knelt before you at the Rosemont ball," Benedict began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "I was making a strategic choice based on practical considerations. I saw in you qualities I needed: competence, maturity, discretion. I chose you because I believed you would fulfill your duties without complicating our arrangement with inconvenient expectations of romance or devotion." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers, and Celeste saw in them everything she had once thought impossible: love, wonder, gratitude, and a vulnerability that he no longer felt the need to hide from her. "I was right about your competence and capability, but I was profoundly wrong about everything else. What I thought would be a convenient arrangement has become the greatest blessing of my life. You have transformed not just my houses but my heart, teaching me that genuine partnership and deep affection are not complications but gifts beyond price." His hand trembled slightly as he held the ring box, this man who never showed uncertainty, and Celeste felt tears begin to slip down her cheeks. "I chose you for practical reasons," he continued, "but I love you for 1,000 reasons I never anticipated. Your strength in facing every challenge with quiet dignity. Your kindness to everyone from the dowager to the youngest scullery maid. Your brilliant mind that challenges and delights me in equal measure. The way you've made Ravenshire feel like a true home rather than merely an estate to be managed. The sound of your laugh, the touch of your hand, the way you look at me as though I am not merely a duke but simply Benedict, a man fortunate enough to have earned your affection." He lifted the ring from its velvet nest, holding it before her with hands that had steadied with renewed purpose. "Accept this ring, accept my love, not from duty or strategy or convenience, but with every part of my soul. Let us renew our vows here, in this garden you created, and begin again not as Duke and convenient Duchess, but as partners who chose each other truly, with full knowledge of what we found together." Celeste could barely see through her tears, but she extended her left hand toward him, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I accept your ring, your love, and your vows with all my heart. You gave me security and position when I needed the most, but you've given me something infinitely more valuable. You've helped me believe that I am worthy of genuine love, not for what I can do but for who I am." Benedict slid the ring onto her finger, then rose and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion and tenderness that needed no words to express its depth. Around them, the roses bloomed in silent witness, and the morning sun gilded everything it touched with the promise of new beginnings. When they finally drew apart, both laughing and crying at once, Benedict took her hand and examined the way the sapphire caught the light against her skin. "It matches your eyes," he said softly. "I spent weeks working with a jeweler to find the exact shade. I wanted you to have something that was yours alone, not a family heirloom laden with history and expectations, but something that represents only us and what we've built together." They walked back to the house hand in hand, their future stretching before them with the same brilliant promise as the spring morning surrounding them. The woman who had once stood alone in the shadows at the Rosemont ball, dismissed as the forgotten spinster, had found not just security or position but genuine love and partnership. She had transformed from overlooked daughter to capable duchess to cherished wife, not because a duke had needed a practical solution, but because two people had discovered in each other the courage to believe in something neither had thought possible. And in the end, that was the greatest transformation of all. At age 9 and 20, society had written Celeste off as a spinster whose time had passed. But her story reminds us of a powerful truth: it is never too late for love to find us. Age doesn't diminish our capacity for deep connection or passionate romance. If anything, the maturity and wisdom we gain with years make us more capable of recognizing and nurturing genuine love when it appears. Celeste's journey teaches us that being overlooked doesn't mean being unworthy, and that the years we spend caring for others, building our character, and developing our strengths are never wasted. Sometimes those very experiences, the quiet competence, the earned wisdom, the depth that only comes with living, are what make us most valuable to the right person. Her story shows us that true love doesn't always announce itself with youthful passion. Sometimes the most profound connections grow slowly, through shared quiet evenings, through respect earned rather than assumed, through the courage to be authentically ourselves even when we fear we might not be enough. Real love recognizes that maturity is not a liability but a gift, that experience brings substance, and that the woman dismissed as too old might be exactly the right age for the love story she was meant to live. Your time is not over. Whether you're 29 or 79, whether society considers you past your prime or you've convinced yourself that chapter of life has closed, Celeste's story whispers a truth we all need to hear. Love has no expiration date, and the heart knows no age limits. The person who will cherish you for exactly who you are might be waiting just beyond the next ballroom door, ready to kneel before you and declare that you are everything they never knew they needed. What part of Celeste and Benedict's journey resonated most with you? Was it the moment Benedict first knelt before her at the ball, defying all of society's expectations? The quiet evenings in the library where their connection deepened? Or perhaps that final scene in the rose garden where love triumphed over every practical arrangement? Drop a comment below and share which moment made your heart flutter. We love hearing how these stories touch you. Show us some love with a like. Your support tells us you want more sweeping Regency romances, more unexpected love stories, and more tales of couples who find their happily ever after against all odds. And don't forget to subscribe and join our growing community of romance enthusiasts. We're building a family of viewers who believe in the power of love stories, whether they're set in Regency ballrooms or modern coffee shops. If this video swept you away, trust us, you'll absolutely adore what we have coming next. More dukes, more passion, more stories that prove love can bloom in the most unexpected places. Hit that subscribe button and let's continue this journey together. After all, every great love story deserves to be shared, and we can't wait to bring you the next one.